everyone. Thank you so much for coming. This is great. My name is Terry Wilson. I'm the president of the Avon Historical Society, and I am here today with my partner Jennifer Bennett, who's the director of the Avon Senior Center. She's the one doing the sound thing right now. Wave Jen. And she's also in charge of the reception afterwards, setting it out, so you want to know her. And we also have the Avon Library as our partner as well in this project. This event is being sponsored through an anonymous donation by a member of the Avon Historical Society, and that person is sitting in the audience, so we thank that person for this. And the reception afterwards, the baked goods are provided by the Avon Historical Society members, so we thank them for that. We appreciate your taking the time to learn about Connecticut's black regiments in the American Civil War through film, narration, images that I know will leave an impression on you today. But first of all, if you are from Avon, which I know many of you are, you may notice or you may have heard or read over the years a talk about the gravestone of Private Leverett Holden in East Avon Cemetery, which is located behind the Avon Congregational Church along Simsbury Road, very close to the fence. Private Holden was born in Vernon, worked in Hartford, and settled here in Avon before joining the Connecticut 29th Regiment. He saw active duty, which you're going to learn about later, so I'm not going to go into that detail, and returned to live out his life here in Avon. But I say gravestone because the actual burial site has come into question just very recently. So to try to answer that question, the East Avon Cemetery Association recently won a state grant to have ground-penetrating radar conducted around Holden's stone, which appears to be segregated from all others in the cemetery, to determine if in fact there's a burial there, the stone is simply honorary, which has been suggested to us, or there are other unmarked graves in that area. 1 year ago right now, during Black History Month, Private Holden's grave site became the 164th site on the Connecticut Freedom Trail. However, until this radar work is done, a cemetery for the official designation is on hold. So just kind of stay tuned and you'll hear more about that over time. Before I turn this over to our moderator, I wish to dedicate today's event to Charles Ben Hawley, who was not only a descendant of the Connecticut 29th and Mass 54th, but he was one of the leaders of the Connecticut Descendants Organization here in Connecticut, and part of the team that created this beautiful monument to the 29th that's in Criscuola Park in New Haven. Ben had intended on traveling up here from Maryland to join us today, but he fell ill over the holidays and passed away just recently. He was with us at Avon, here in Avon in 2014 for the rededication of Private Holden's site, a grave site. He is the second one from the right, and some of you may recognize the gentleman way far on the right. That's Kevin Johnson. He portrays William Webb, who was also from Vernon. I always wondered if he and Leverett knew each other, but anyway, he portrays William Webb and does a wonderful job. And then the other folks on the left, the first 1, 2, 3, 4, are all descendants of members of the Connecticut 29th. So they were here 10 years ago right now for the rededication of Private Holden's grave. And also, my husband and I traveled down to Washington at his suggestion, and we went to the African American Civil War Museum in Washington. This is not the big museum that just opened recently. This one's been open for quite a while. It's dedicated just to the African American story of the Civil War. We are standing in front of a gigantic wall photo that you're going to see later, which is the only image of the Connecticut 29th Regiment that exists. It's in the Library of Congress. It's going to be in all the slides that you see today, and we're standing in front of that. It took me by complete surprise when I walked in the museum, and there was the wall with the 29th on there. It was just spectacular to see that. So Ben would have been here, and I'm sorry he's not. But anyway, so today, I think that's all I have, right? Today, we have with us three people. The first one is now a new friend of mine, who I have the pleasure of serving with on the Connecticut Freedom Trail Committee, Mr. John Mills, whose personal story and journey, he will tell you in a few minutes, is president of the nonprofit Alex Breanne Corporation here in Connecticut, which works to research and tell the story of enslaved African Americans in this country. I'm going to let him tell you his story. So thank you, John, for being with us, and I'm going to hand this to you, I guess, because you're going to do that part.
Okay.
All right, and here, this too. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you. I appreciate you guys giving me the time to talk today. I've got way too many slides, so I'm going to try to go through this a little quickly, but hopefully you can get the information in the context of what I'm trying to talk about. I'm from a transplant. I'm not really from Connecticut. I'm from San Diego. I was born and raised in San Diego during the time when the Panthers and the other organization were starting to come into fold. And my father preached a lot of what they preached to me about being proud of my skin color and my features. He was trying to ensure that I didn't let society make me have my own biases against myself. That was his intent. But that didn't really work. Once I was in my 20s, I realized I had biases against myself. And I realized it as I had my daughter and how I was raising her to think. I recognized it. And in recognizing that, I decided that I can't be the only one. Everyone must have some form of this. And are they interrogating? Because it was a daily thing for me. I had to interrogate that every day. I wasn't trying to use these things that somehow I had in my head. And so I tried to figure out how to impact the outside world so that they wouldn't self-interrogate. I didn't know how to do that until late 90s. My sister starts telling me about my genealogy. My grandfather, his name was Miles Mills. He passed in 1987. I knew him really well. But I knew he was from Texas. I don't know how he got to California. I knew nothing about his story. My sister comes to me one day and she's like, you know, I found his mother's death certificate, and she was in Henderson, Texas. She passed away in 1918 of influenza. And I was like, I know that. That's the flu pandemic, 1918. We gotta go find this. Where is this? And she goes, hold on, I got more. His father's name was Robert Mills, and he's also buried in the same place as her. And his grandfather's name was Ned Mills, and he was enslaved. So that was the first I had known of anybody I was related to that was enslaved. And his last name, Mills, was only Mills because his enslaver's name was Mills, which forced me to reinterrogate my name as John Mills. I was like, wait a minute, I'm so proud of this last name as if there was like some genealogical reason for it. Now I'm like, that was just the last family that owned us, right? It was a self-interrogation. So we decided we're going to Texas to go, this is 2003, right? We're gonna go to Texas and try to find this cemetery, this Hickory Grove Cemetery, where my great-grandmother and great-grandfather and my great-great-grandfather are at. So we fly to Texas, and in Texas, we find Hickory Grove Cemetery, we walk through it, pristine, beautiful, beautiful cemetery, but we don't find anybody we know. And by then we had this huge family tree. We found no one in there. Until we realized that there's a slightly driven path around the side of the cemetery that led into the woods. So we walked into the woods, and in the woods we saw what you see on the right there. That's from, ironically, the 4th of July 2003 when we were walking into those woods. And to upper right, that's my sister who was there with me in 2003. And you can see to her left was the white-only cemetery, and we were about to walk into the woods. That's me at the bottom. We went back this past year to try to clean it up. And so we're still struggling to find our ancestors because there's like layers and layers and layers of debris and there are fallen trees. And so we're not really finding them, but we know where they are. That struck a chord in me and seeing that these people weren't only like demeaned in life, they were actually demeaned in death. They were segregated in death as well. And that made me think. And it got me thinking that maybe telling these types of stories might help with my original plight, which was to try to get other folks to self-interrogate things that they may not know they have, unconscious biases. We continued on, and my sister tells me about my grandfather's great-grandfather. So it was like my third great-grandfather. My grandfather was from Baltimore, on my mother's side. And every day of my life, anytime I saw him, he saluted me. He's like a heavy naval guy. But he didn't know a lot about his family either. But my sister finds out that his great-grandfather's name was William Cooper, who was also in the Navy. Like, had we known that when he was alive, we could have told him, he would have been ecstatic. But he was in the Navy, he fought in the Civil War. And after the war, he lives out his life in Baltimore, dies in 1909. He's buried at Lawrence Cemetery, which is a historic African-American cemetery at the time in Baltimore. But in the late 1950s, unbeknownst to me, my sister takes me to go find his gravesite. in Baltimore. And we get there, and it's nothing more than a parking lot. And so I'm like, she knew, I didn't know this. In 1957, the city of Baltimore took it over, they paved it over, now it's a shopping center, and the estimations are that there's some 35 to 40,000 African-American bodies buried under that parking lot, including my third great grandfather. So now I've gone down these two paths, and each of them are like degradation, segregation, and death, paved over cemetery, and there were others. This was just the two that I thought I would fit into this. There were other lines I went down, and we came to the same place. Which got me thinking, these are the types of stories I should start to tell, because it personalizes it. It's like when we tell these stories, it's not just a story. Like it's related to me, like I'm a part of the story because my descendants are a part of these stories, right? And so that's what I do. I tend to tell the stories of local history and aligning them to my own. So here in Connecticut, I moved here in 1998. I start interrogating local stories sometime around 2020. Because of the pandemic, I couldn't really travel, so I started really interrogating local stuff. And one of the stories I started interrogating is the story of Prince Mortimer, who was someone you guys may know about. He was an enslaved man in Middletown, Connecticut. He was brought here from Guinea in the 1730s. And sometime in the 1750s, he was sold to Philip Mortimer, who at the time was a really wealthy man who owned a rope walk, a place where you made ropes. And back then, a rope walk had to be as long as the longest rope you're going to make. So he had this 1,000-foot building that was only like 20 feet wide. It's a very odd building. But they made rope in this building, and Prince Mortimer was a spinner in that building, a very skilled position of making rope, and he was there for many, many years doing that. When he was around 70 years old, his enslaver was old and had a will, and his will freed him. And then the enslaver passes away, and he thinks he's going to be free, but he's not. The enslaver's son-in-law, his name was George Starr, challenges the will. The will is overturned, and now Prince Mortimer is enslaved to the son-in-law. And he remains enslaved to the son-in-law for another 17 years until he's 87. And then when he's 87 years old, one morning, the son-in-law sees chunks in his morning chocolate, accuses Prince Mortimer of putting arsenic in his morning chocolate. Prince Mortimer goes to prison for life. They send him to Newgate Prison in East Granby at 87 years old, and that was in 1811. And as you guys probably all know, that you had to go down in the mines, and at least for the first 4 years he did, because they had no above ground cells until 1815. So he was there until 1827, and then in 1827 he was moved to Wethersfield Prison when they shut down Newgate Prison, which is where the Department of Motor Vehicles is current day in Wethersfield. And in 1834 he died and supposedly buried in the prison cemetery, which is Cove Park, right next to Wethersfield D&D today. And there's a plaque there today, you can see it over there on the left, of where the prison cemetery used to be. The gentleman there is a good friend of mine, his name is Frank Winarski. He's a historian in Wethersfield, and so he would help me as I was digging through this story about Prince Mortimer. By the way, I run a nonprofit. It's called Alex Breanne Corporation. It's named after my youngest daughter. And what we do is find stories like this, interrogate them, and then try to inject these stories in the communities where these people lived, worked, or died. With regards to Prince Mortimer, we got work going on in Wethersfield, in Middletown, where he worked and lived, Prince Mortimer, to do just that. There's a developer at the location where the rope walk was, where he worked, who is redeveloping that property to create affordable housing and office space. And that developer has agreed to foot $25,000 towards memorializing Prince Mortimer in that facility. So I'm working with J.R. Carnegie Hargraves, a developer in Middletown, to do that. As well as put a plaque, and there's going to be a park named after Prince Mortimer where he worked all those years. And also I'm working with the town because his enslaver had a mansion there, and there was a road, or there was a walkway back when he was there. It's today, current day, it's a road. It's called Barlow Avenue, and I'm working with the town to rename that road to Prince Mortimer Avenue. We've got a meeting tomorrow on that.
How old was he when he died?
He was, thank you so much. He was 110 years old when he died, when he finally died. And he went through a lot while he was at both of these prisons, but specifically once he was at Wethersfield Prison, because a lot of the wardens there, they were a little corrupt. And so they would take food that was supposed to be given to the inmates, they would take it home, they would feed them spoiled food. And so there were a lot of investigations of those wardens, one of which, while it was going on, Prince Mortimer was in the prison hospital for weeks on end, complaining of problems with his bowels because he was drinking the bad water and eating the bad food. So he was suffering while he was in Wethersfield. But anyway, we're working to memorialize in Middletown, and that's going to happen. But back to the previous slide, Fred Winarski, he tells me while we're digging the Prince Mortimer and whether or not he was buried there at Wethersfield, we eventually determined he probably wasn't, because at the time the prisons would send bodies to Yale for dissection if they didn't have family, and he was so old he wouldn't have had family at that time. He outlived everybody, and so we kind of believed his body was actually sent to Yale for dissection. But while we were doing that work, he tells me, John, you know, there was another guy buried here, his name was Nicholas Monroe, and he was also a veteran. And he was in the 29th or the 30th. And I'm like, who's the 29th and the 30th? Like, I didn't know anything about it, right? And he's like, yeah, Nicholas Monroe, you gotta check that out. And so I start digging into this Nicholas Monroe guy. I eventually find out that his body also was sent to Yale. There's actually documentation of him dying in prison and his body being sent to Yale. But I go to the state library, I'm talking to Kevin Johnson about, you know, this guy. No one really knows much about him. I start looking up newspaper articles about this guy, and I'm seeing him mentioned in various ways. He was kind of being exploited in Hartford. After the war, he had like one eye, and they would like put him in prize fights with people that were also handicapped. And I'm finding all these things. He eventually goes to prison because he couldn't afford to live. He's stealing, and he goes to prison, and that's how he ends up dying at Wethersfield Prison. And so Kevin Johnson didn't know a whole lot about him, but he tells me, you should go down to that memorial in Quisquilla Park in New Haven, so you can, you know, maybe he's on there and you can learn some more stuff. So I go down to the memorial, and he's not on the memorial, right? And so I'm like, that's odd. But then I realized it's the 29th memorial. And as I'm looking through his muster rolls, he's in the 30th. But then I realized there are 30th people on the memorial. So I started realizing the memorial may not be complete, right? And then that's when I really start digging, and I find out that there were 1,778 people across the 29th and the 30th. But the memorial has 1,000 names, which means there's 778 people missing right off of the memorial. And that interested me. Now I wanted to like challenge that and figure out like, how do we get those people recognized, number one? And then what was their full scope of their sacrifice? Like what were they facing truly? Like I wanted to know more about this. Like, am I going too far, kind of pushing to make sure every name is recognized? Like I wanted to know more about it. And that's when I really started digging into these two regiments. And first I wanted to learn about the Civil War as it related to Connecticut. The first thing I learned was that the Militia Act of 1792, after the Revolutionary War, was set up so that each state would be required to create their own militia. And within the Militia Act of 1792, it says right in it, able-bodied white male citizens. So if you were black, you weren't really supposed to be a part of the state militia. And that becomes important because Later on, as states start creating colored regiments, there are some requirement to change law before that can really happen, right? But understanding that the Militia Act of 1792 did not really allow African Americans to serve in state militias. So Civil War is underway, and in summer 1862 is the 7 Days Battle in Virginia, and in that battle, lots of casualties. The Union Army suffers 16,000 casualties, the Confederate Army suffers 20,000, and at this point, this is clearly an impactful conflict, and Lincoln's trying to be strategic in a way to kind of end this. How do we get these states that are seceded to recognize that this is not going to go well for them? So the first thing he does is in July of 1862, he issues the Confiscation Act. Basically, what the Confiscation Act was, okay, if we come to one of these seceded areas and we capture a land or a home or property, and there's an enslaved person on that property of these people that are rebels against the Union, then those people are now free, qualified, if you're fighting against the Union. So it didn't mean that everybody in these Confederate seceded states were free. Just if we confiscated something and there were enslaved people there, those people are now free, right? And so that was the Confiscation Act. But more importantly, he creates an update to the Militia Act. 1792 Militia Act said you had to be white. Now the 1862 Militia Act has a line in it that says persons of African descent, and it qualifies it above. They can do entrenchments or camp service or labor, you know. But the most important line in there to me is where it says military or naval service for which they may be found competent. Basically, if you say they're competent, then they can do it, which means you could give them a gun, they can now be soldiers. So this is mid-1862, the Militia Act has now said you could create a colored regiment, right? Another thing that's interesting to me about that time is the Militia Act also, right within it says, you're to pay them $10 per month, and you can take $3 out of them for their clothing. So really it's $7. What's interesting about that is at the time, you know, the lowest paid private who was white was being paid $13 a month, and they weren't pulling anything out for clothing. So it's very clear, right, that there's a disparity. I don't know if I need to go through the slide. It was a slide I put together at one point because I would hear often about how there were African Americans in the Civil War that were promoting to officers. And there's context in that, right? And there are non-commissioned and there are commissioned officers. Commissioned officers mean like a governing body commissions you to be an officer. Like the federal government said you're an officer. Everybody in yellow, all those roles in yellow, those are commissioned officers. The gray, the dark gray, those are non-commissioned officers. That means a commissioned officer said, we're gonna let you manage some people, right? But what's interesting about it is the disparity in pay, right? So there were a lot of African Americans that went from private to corporal to sergeant, so they're in that gray bucket, so they're actually officers, they're non-commissioned officers, but their pay didn't change much. But where you see commissioned officers, that's where it's like, those are the prestigious roles. And once we start talking about like these regiments, you see where that goes into play, because all of these colored regiments were all managed by white Americans. All the commissioned officers were generally white Americans. There were 180,000 African Americans that fought in the Civil War. Of those 180,000, there were 80 commissioned officers that were black. I mean, that's 0.004%. Like, it's literally unheard of. So I think it's an interesting point to kind of understand the economics of it all. So back to the Militia Act of 1862. Immediately, states start creating state militias, because the Militia Act said we can put them in a role that we think they're fit for. So Louisiana starts creating these colored regiments, South Carolina does, Kansas does. I know Louisiana and South Carolina are actually seceded states, but there were portions of those states that were still in control by the Union. So within those states, they were creating Union militias at the time. So we get to another inflection point. Now we're in September of 1862, and another huge battle, the Battle of Antietam, it's in Maryland, and lots of casualties, 12,000 in the Union, 10,000 for the Confederacy, and Lincoln now has another strategic move to make. He's got to do something. The Militia Act didn't work. The Confiscation Act didn't work. And so he issues his preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. Now this is broader. Now it's like, if you don't stop the secession by January 1st, 1863, then it doesn't matter if your homestead or your location is in rebel against the Union. Any state that has seceded, anyone in it that's African American, they're now free. So now it's broad, right? That's the Emancipation Proclamation. And that didn't work either. The Confederate president just kind of laughed at it, and he put out a statement that if we catch any of these African people, we're going to hand them over to the states to treat them like we would a slave that did something like that. Basically meaning we're going to kill them, right? So it didn't really work. So then Lincoln goes further. And so in March of 1863, after now the Emancipation Proclamation is in place, he issues the Enrollment Act, basically a draft. He's saying, we need more men because these guys aren't stopping. So every state, you're going to have to enroll any man between the age of 20 and 45, and so that we can, start this draft. He has specific quotas by state. And at that time, in February of 1863, like the 54th in Massachusetts starts enlisting, and in March they bring forth the 54th. One state that didn't, Connecticut. Connecticut didn't react with the Militia Act of 1862. They didn't react with the Emancipation Proclamation. They didn't react with the Enrollment Act in March of 1863. They didn't really do anything. But eventually they were forced to. So their quota was Connecticut's quota was 7,700 men. And by November of 1863, Connecticut had contributed 2,300 men. So they were 5,400 men under. So Lincoln's like, all right, Connecticut, you guys are slacking. So if you don't give us our 5,400 men, by January 1st of 1864, we're going to double that. It's going to be 11,000. Right, so Lincoln's putting the pressure on Connecticut because they're not contributing enough at their quota. They weren't contributing. And so, as a possibility to solve for this, Benjamin Pardee, who was Provost Marshal of 2nd District here in Connecticut, says, well, wait a minute, all these other states are raising colored regiments. We could just raise colored regiments and it'll get us to our quota, and then we won't have this problem, right? And so he puts that up for consideration, and immediately Connecticut legislatures are like, you are nuts. Specifically, William Eaton, at the time he was Chief Judge of Hartford, he eventually becomes a delegate from Connecticut. He becomes a U.S. Senator representing Connecticut. He's in the House of Representatives. All after the Civil War, he becomes a very influential person from Connecticut. And he's like, give guns to black people? That is the most disgraceful and vilest bill ever introduced in the Connecticut legislature. He says, I would sooner let loose the wild Comanche than the ferocious Negro. These black people are going to invade the homes of their former masters with lust, raping, and murder. And that was a common context here in Connecticut. It was like, give black people guns? Like, what are you talking about? But they were in a pickle. Lincoln's saying, you got to give us these 5,400 men. I mean, what's going on? And so, you can see that this all starts mid-November of 1863, and now we're at November 19th. And they had to just kind of secede. They were like, yeah, we have no other choice. We got to raise a colored regiment. We got no other choice. So they decide to raise a colored regiment, and that's what brings us to the discussion that I think we're going to be having today. Chris Barlow's movie is going to show you kind of what happens from that. John Noone's movie is going to kind of tell you kind of what happens from that. I want to kind of give you the context of what these men were facing. You have to understand, they weren't citizens. Black people wouldn't become citizens until the 14th Amendment, which was not ratified until 1868. So they weren't affected by the Enrollment Act. They couldn't be drafted. They didn't have to fight. They could have just stayed home. There was nothing imploring them to fight, right? And so you have to understand that. They were not citizens, they didn't have to fight. But even though there were thousands of men, when they heard there were colored regiments, that just merged on Connecticut. And a couple of them are Alexander Noone and Isaac J. Hill. Both of them wrote narratives after they served in the 29th. These pictures, I found both of them in Alexander Newton's book, Out of the Briars, which was actually published in 1910. But Isaac J. Hill's was actually the first one. He just had no pictures of himself or anyone else in his book. His was actually published in 1867. It was like within a couple years after the war was over and he was back home. And he talks in detail about every step of the way of how his experience with the 29th. He talks about also that he was born and raised in Selins Grove, Pennsylvania. He was bound out to a man in Kentucky when he was a kid, because his family didn't have a lot of money. While he's in Kentucky, he's basically enslaved, but as he's growing up, he's learning to read from young white kids in Kentucky. He gets a little older and they find out he can read, so they send him back to Pennsylvania, because that was illegal for black people to know to read there. And in Pennsylvania, he joins the 6th Pennsylvania Cavalry, even though he couldn't fight. So he would just go out with them and dig the trenches and do things like that. And then in November 1863, when he heard that, wait a minute, Connecticut's letting us carry guns, he raced out of Pennsylvania for Connecticut to join the 29th. Alexander Noone, he was from New Bern, North Carolina. And his mother was a free black woman in New Bern. His father was enslaved in New Bern. And his mother wanted to free the father. Her name was Mary Newton. So she went to New York and started working with famous abolitionists to figure out how to free the husband. And eventually they were able to raise the money to go back and free her husband. And they immediately moved to New Haven in 1860 with their 5 children, Alexander Newton being one of them. He then goes back to New York and he joins the 13th New York Regiment. Again, just like Isaac J. Hill, he couldn't fight, so he's just digging trenches, he's going out with regiments. Until the race riots in New York in 1863. Because of that draft, there were people in New York that were really upset that all these black people are here, but they don't have to fight. And they didn't like the fact that Lincoln was even trying to free them. They were afraid that these people were going to be freed and then take their jobs. So in New York, a big race riot in 1863. They burned down an all-black orphanage. They were chasing black people through the streets. And Alexander Newton had to flee New York. He flees back to New Haven. And when he's there, he learns that his brother, Stephen Newton, who was 18 years old, who had joined the 54th Regiment, had died. He had died at the assault on Fort Wagner, which is the battle that you see at the end of the movie Glory. And so I'm sure that weighed heavy on his head, and when he learned that Connecticut was going to let black people fight, he also joins the 29th. And so that's how both of those men come to know and be part of the 29th. Both of the films you're going to hear about are based, John Noone's is based on Alexander Newton's book. Chris Barlow's is based on Isaac J. Hill's book. And I think these are the only narratives I know of. So they're very telling and very interesting. Another interesting part of the story is that, so we're still mid-November. You know, Connecticut's being forced to like enlist colored men. And they put out a general order, because they need them bad. They got to get these men by January 1st, 1864. So they put out a general order of bounties that you'll get, bonuses you'll get if you enlist. And it said that the federal government's going to give you $300 in $60 installments. And we, the state, we're going to give you $300 if you enlist before January 5th. And then there was another $30 installment that they were going to give folks. And the recruiter, whoever got you to come and enlist, we're going to give them $15. Well, Isaac J. Hill and Alexander Noone read that as, I brought myself. No one enlisted me. So I should get that $60 installment, plus I should get the $15 recruiter fee. What they didn't know that is within a week of that general order going out, Connecticut puts out another one. They thought about it and they're like, we don't want to give the African Americans that much money. So the federal government portion, we're not going to give them. I don't know if they capped it to like counter the fact that they were going to give them their own $300, or if the federal government decided. I don't know how that played, but they put out a new general order specifically for African American men. They were not giving them that, and they weren't giving the recruiter fee. But if you understand the 60 plus the 15, they were expecting when they showed up, they're getting $75. Right? And so when you read Isaac J. Hill's book, he talks about it. He's like, the flag was presented by Reverend Dr. Mike. They're about to go off to war. And he says, on account of the regiment not receiving their $75, which was promised them at their enlistment, they made no response to the presentation of the flag. That's very interesting to me because I've heard about Jesse Owens in the 1936 Olympics, and he's not invited to the White House, and he makes a big deal about that. I heard about, the men in the 1968 Olympics making a stand with the presentation of the flag during the Olympics with the Black Power. I've heard about Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf, Chris Jackson in the early 90s in the NBA, and he's like, because of oppression and bias and racism, he doesn't recognize the flag. I've heard about Colin Kaepernick, but I had never heard that the black men of the 29th, they weren't paid, so they didn't make any mention. They didn't move when the flag was presented. I think that's a very interesting thing that it goes unnoticed. Most people don't recognize that. They also, both of them talk about the same thing about when they were first left Connecticut, they go to Maryland, they're in Annapolis. Maryland was a border state, so they didn't secede. So none of these things about freeing slaves applied to them. So slavery was still allowed there, even during the Civil War. And they talk about when they got there, Isaac J. Hill says, a great many of the colored people had caught the distemper from the whites, their so-called masters. It was hard to find a pleasant family of colored people in the place. They appeared to be afraid to speak to us. In Alexander Newton's book, he says, the colored people in this place were afraid to speak to us. Their masters looked on us with contempt. So they're in Annapolis, and they're feeling racism from the people that are in this, state that didn't secede. But not only that, Captain Griswold of the B Company of the 29th, he's there as well, and he makes a statement in letters he's sending back to his sister that align with everything they said in their books. He's like, while they're in Annapolis, he says, I've seen hardly anyone but darkies. However, I suppose that there are some respectable white folks here. There seems to be a prejudice here against the colored troops. So you kind of see his racism and bias in his verbiage, and you recognize that where they're at, they're facing racism in the field. So it's not just from the Confederate Army, it's not just from the state of Connecticut, it's not just from the leadership within the regiments that they're in, but it's also from everyday people in the places that they're going. Right, they're facing challenge with racism. Isaac J. Hill also talks about how while in battle in Virginia, he sees a man that's been shot, a black man. So he props him up against a tree and he runs back to his post. He comes back hours later and the man's still sitting in the same spot, like the medics never got to him. But he saw the medics go into other white officers and soldiers that had been injured, but they never got to this black man. And so he makes a statement in his book about that. He's like, the complexion and rank of a man had a great bearing. There was a great distinction made among the wounded. Now remember, these people weren't drafted, they didn't have to be here. But they're facing racism from every angle, even from their state. Another interesting thing that I found about this entire story is that in Connecticut, Civil War is over, and the 29th is in Texas, and so was the 30th. There were 2 Connecticut regiments at the time. They're in colored regiments at the time. They're in Texas. They're waiting for orders to be sent back to Hartford. And Connecticut is putting up for vote. They're like, maybe we should let these black men who fought for us have the right to vote. What do you guys think about that? And so in the papers of the time, you see these editorials of people talking about what they thought about this idea. And you would hear editorials in the papers like, we can't do that because the black men will feel like they're equal. They might elect Negroes. They might become friends with white men. They might intermarry with white women. So the state of Connecticut votes that down. They vote that we're not going to let these black men have the right to vote. And you see that mentioned in Isaac J. Hill's book, if you know what to look for. So they're coming back, they get to New York, and after New York, the 29th and 30th, they're supposed to then sail to Hartford, where they're to be celebrated, they think. They weren't sure, right? In New York, while they're about to come back to Hartford, Isaac J. Hill says in his book, he says, the boys of the 29th were feeling somewhat indignant in reference to the treatment they received from their state, talking about not giving them the right to vote. It not giving them their rights. Like, they weren't all too happy. The 29th was not all too happy about coming back here to Connecticut, right? They felt like we just did all this. We weren't drafted. We did all this, and now you won't let us vote. So you gotta, I think all of this kind of gives you a context of like, really who Connecticut was at that time, thus what they were facing. And I think you have to really kind of understand that to understand how great these people were, right? I think you have to tell the full story to understand their sacrifice, thus their greatness, right? So I've been trying my best to make sure I honor these men where I can. I chased down what happened with Isaac J. Hill after the war. He went to New Jersey, lived out his life in New Jersey. When he died in 1882, he was buried at a cemetery, it leaves me now. Red Brick Cemetery? I'm sure I got that wrong. But anyway, he's buried at this cemetery, and in 1862, that cemetery is taken over by the city, and they pave it over, and they put a parking garage there. And they say they moved the bodies across town to Broad Street Cemetery. Today it's called Presbyterian Cemetery of Woodbury. But when you go there, you see stones, but they're not really aligned to like graves. They're just kind of lined up against a fence. One of them is Isaac J. Hill's stone that was moved from that location that was paved over. But it's completely worn, you can't really read anything on it. And that disturbed me. I mean, I walked through too many places where my family ended in the same way. And so I worked with the VA, and they're sending us a new stone. I've been working with the Presbyterian Church who manages that cemetery, and they're going to allow me to install that stone. We're going to do that on February 24th. On the new stone, I found a facility to install the stone. On the stone, we're going to have his picture, we're going to have a QR code, so if people come by, they'll be able to learn all about him and the book that he wrote. But all that's happening on February 24th. We've got news media down there that are all interested in the story. I also traced down his family. His family's they didn't know they were related to him, but they're going to be at this event as well. As it relates to Alexander Newton, he also, after the war, went to New Jersey. He dies in New Jersey. I know where his burial's at. I know where his stone's at. But his parents, remember his parents? His dad who was an enslaved man, his mother who went and fought and freed him. She also remained in New York for a little while after she freed him, and she was a part of the Underground Railroad. She freed other families, right? So they were true abolitionists and then moved to New Haven. But she was buried at Evergreen Cemetery in New Haven, and that's her stone. That's me sitting at her and her husband's stone. It fell over some, 80 years ago, broke in half, and then started just kind of seeping into the ground. So my nonprofit is actually paying for that to be repaired this spring. And so we're gonna prop that thing back up, we're repairing it. But not only that, if you remember, Alexander Newton's brother, Stephen Newton, died in the assault on Fort Wagner as a part of the 54th. And we were able to work with the VA to get a stone for him as well, because no one knows where he's buried. All of those African Americans who died in that battle were buried in a mass grave by the Confederates. So he's kind of just lost, his brother. And so we're going to be installing a stone for his brother right next to his parents' stone. All that's happening in the spring, and then we're going to unveil it in June. Again, this stuff is kind of a passion for me, because as I stated at the beginning of this is how I would find my descendants. Like, I would go and it would be a parking lot, right? There would be woods, it would be a withered away stone. And so it disturbs me when I see it, so we're correcting that. There's another man that I'm going to be honoring. This is a little off topic, but I just want to say it, and hopefully you guys can help me with this. There was a gentleman by the name of Fortune in Waterbury. You may know this story. In the 1700s, Fortune was owned by a man in Waterbury by the name of Preserve Porter. Preserve Porter was a bone doctor. One day, it said that Fortune slipped at the side of the Naugatuck. I'm not sure if it's really the Naugatuck. The research I do, I'm not convinced it's the Naugatuck. But the story is he slipped at the bank of the Naugatuck, fell into the river, broke his neck, he dies. Preserve Porter, this bone doctor, saw an opportunity. He pulls him out of the river, and right there at the riverside, he cuts his body into these pieces. Takes his body back to his home. Puts his body in a pot, boils it down so all the flesh falls off, and then he uses the bones to open a school of anatomy. And he starts teaching doctors anatomy with these bones. The bones pass down to his son becomes a doctor. The bones pass down to his son becomes a doctor. The bones pass down to that son's granddaughter. She becomes a doctor. She graduates from Johns Hopkins. And we get to the early 1930s. Miss Sally McGlannon, Dr. Sally McGlannon, had these bones, and she thought I should donate them. They were my family's tools of their profession. I should donate them back to the museum in Waterbury. And so she sends letters to the Matatuck Museum in Waterbury about how she used to play with these bones when she was a kid, and they were her prized possession. And the Matatuck Museum says, oh yeah, we'd love to have those, show like an enslaved person that used to be here as an exhibit. And so they take the bones, they send them to Germany. Germany articulates them so that they're together like they can move like with joints. They put the bones, you got to hear them up there in the upper left, into a display at the Matatuck Museum. And they stay in that display from 1933 until 1970. Until a resident was like, that is some inappropriate stuff. Like, what are you doing? And so they pull the bones down out of the display, put them in a box, put them in the basement at the Matatuck Museum. They stay there until the 1990s, until Miss Maxine Watts, on the left picture, she's in the white sweater. She was the president of the local Waterbury NAACP chapter at the time. She's like, wait a minute, there's a person telling me you got bones in the basement at the Matatuck Museum, what's going on? So they pull them out, and archaeologists start studying these things for like a decade. They're trying to figure out what he ate, what his life was like. They're learning that he worked hard in life, he had torn ligaments, and he had a broken back that had healed, he was working with that. They're learning all this stuff. They have an artist using his skull create a painting of what he would have looked like. And so they do all this stuff, and finally in 2013 they're like, wait a minute, aren't we doing the same thing that everyone has done all these years? Just kind of use this man's bones. Like, he had a family, he had a wife when he died. That was all stolen from them. They couldn't give him a proper burial. Like, shouldn't we just bury him? So they finally bury him on September 12th, 2013. And that's me on the left, because I was able to get his burial site on the Connecticut Freedom Trail this past September, on the 10-year anniversary of him finally being buried. But also, we're trying to create a mural in Waterbury in his honor. And I'm working with the Rise Up group to do that. The mural's going to cost us some $30,000. We've raised $18,000 to date with regards to the mural. And so, again, I just wanted to tell that story in case anyone here would like to help us get that story over the goal line. I have flyers about it at the back of the room. There's a QR code on there. If you put your phone over it, it'll take you to our GoFundMe page. If you can kind of help us with that, I'd appreciate it. And with that, again, my nonprofit is the Alex Breanne Corporation. Again, we do this type of stories that we do, and we try to inject these people into the community where they live, work, and die. Once we find out about them, I will now hand this off to Chris to talk about his research into the 29th and show you his movie. Thanks a lot.
Okay, that was great, John. Really appreciate that. And I learned a lot. I'm already starting to, I don't have any slides, but I learned a whole bunch even just listening to that. And this is an evolving field. I am not a Civil War historian by any stretch of the imagination. I'm just going to give you a little bit of brief history about how I got involved. So my spouse and I, Twana, who's also here in the audience, are, I'll say, recent homeowners. We bought a home in Berlin, Connecticut about 5 years ago. During ourselves just kind of going out on a nice crisp October day, going out for a nice walk. We were walking up and down Farmington Avenue, which is the main drag in Berlin, Connecticut, and we happened to notice a black-faced doll that had a sign on it that said "Join Upbeat." And we've been in the town for only a few months. We weren't quite sure what that was. Did a little research and found out that it was a civic club that was part of the Berlin High School, and it had been around for decades. We took a picture of it, sent a email over to the superintendent of the schools, and said, "This was surprising. Do you guys not realize that this is a racially insensitive display? Oh, we're so sorry." And they invited us to join the Berlin Board of Education Social Justice and Equity Committee. But great, that's awesome that Berlin is interested in attacking racial issues, that they're interested in social justice, that it's something that's important for the town. There were probably about 50 of us from around the town who were part of that particular racial justice and equity committee. It happened during the pandemic, so all of our meetings we had were via Zoom. We had a great facilitator out of Glastonbury who walked us through a whole bunch of social justice and equity terms and concepts, things like racial bias and social justice and things of that nature. We noticed, however, that every single month, fewer and fewer residents were part of the Social Justice and Equity Committee. We used to have little breakout groups in Zoom where we would go and talk with our fellow residents. We started to talk about some of these issues, and it turned out that more and more residents were getting more uncomfortable with what it was. The program was supposed to be a 2-year program, and we went through the entire first year of the school with our facilitator, again, over Zoom, and everything was great. Then it turns out that at the turn of the next school year, all of a sudden, our facilitator was gone. There were a couple of meetings that they wanted to have in person, and we attended them, but again, the attendance kept getting smaller and smaller. Then all of a sudden we learned in October of that year, after we had only had one meeting, that conservatives within the Board of Education decided to unilaterally dismantle the Social Justice and Equity Committee. About 12 of us stood up and said, we still think it's important for us to really address these issues, and we formed what we call the Berlin Equity Action Team. So we are a nonprofit that's set up in Berlin, and we are advocating for social justice and equity issues. One of the things that we decided to do in order to make an impact was we decided to inaugurate and have our first Juneteenth celebration in Berlin. Berlin has never had a Juneteenth celebration before. It actually happened to be in 2021, which was the first year that Juneteenth became a national holiday. We didn't kind of know what we were doing. We basically funded all of this stuff out of our own pockets. But we partnered with the Berlin Historical Society. We also partnered with our local library, the Berlin Peck Library. We invited some speakers in. We had a presentation. It went pretty well. I mean, for us to be able to do this just on our whim, just kind of shoestring budget, we did a great job. We had about 50 people who attended. It was great to talk about that. One of the key things that we talked about in our first Juneteenth was we were aware from the work that we did with the Avon Historical Society that there were a couple of homes in town that were rumored to be part of the Underground Railroad. We got a proclamation made from the mayor to honor one of those. And that was kind of the signature thing that we talked about for our Juneteenth celebration. So proclamation, we talked about it. We talked about what the Underground Railroad was, why that was important. And we also started to learn a little bit more about the abolitionist culture in the town of Berlin. You guys may notice my shirt says Wide Awakes. And what does that mean? There's actually the prized possession of the Berlin Historical Society is something called the Wide Awakes Lantern. It is one of only a handful in the world that is still intact. If you ever go to the...
We have one here at Avon. It's on display right now in the Avon Library in the History Corner.
And there's another one.
There is one, yes, there's another one.
There's another one. So yeah, but ours is the prized possession of the Berlin Historical Society. And we started to research. I wondered, well, who were the Wide Awakes and what were they about? So it turns out that in the presidential election of 1860, there were a group of abolitionists, most of them white, although some of them black as well, who were interested in, number one, making sure that Abraham Lincoln was elected president. Most of the folks wanted to make sure that slavery was abolished as well, not necessarily because there was a great affinity for the plight of black people, but more so because they didn't want southern states to have additional political power. So that being said, there were some people who were abolitionists, in quotation marks, I'm going to put it that way, because again, they wanted to make sure that the slaveholding states didn't have political power, but they weren't necessarily people who were concerned about the freedom of black people per se. But the Wide Awakes were actually started in Hartford, Connecticut, and Berlin was one of the original, and I guess Avon is as well.
Ours was not from Avon. Ours was given to us years ago from another community, but we have one.
Okay.
And it's, yeah, we know that.
Ours is original.
Is this Smithsonian Smart?
Question, yes.
Yeah, this is the first time I've heard about one. When you say we have one, what one? What?
Yeah, about to share. We have what is called a Wide Awakes lantern. It is a lantern. It is probably about 2 feet tall and about 1 foot wide. It is made of glass. It is inscribed with Wide Awakes, a similar thing with an eye, and that's kind of the part of what the Wide Awakes, their symbol was. And they used to hold torch-lit parades in various cities around the country. Again, it was started in Hartford, but it spread out across the country. There were ones in Kansas City, Missouri. There were ones in Boston, Chicago, you name it. They were all over the place in the United States. And there were probably hundreds of thousands of Wide Awakes around the country. Berlin themselves had a 100-strong Wide Awakes club themselves. And actually the ladies of the Wide Awakes created the lantern for the town of Berlin itself. So that was kind of really what got me interested in what this was going on. So along the way, as we were continuing to learn more about the Wide Awakes, after we had our first Juneteenth celebration, the folks in the Berlin Historical Society started doing more research around what do we know about African Americans at the time that were in our town, and discovered, at least initially, that there were 8 African American men who had served in the 29th, but they didn't really know that much about them. They just knew that there were 8, they knew that they were from the town of Berlin, and they were working on trying to figure out more about their studies. So that's kind of where I came in. Since we had already had Juneteenth before, we had a great turnout for that, I thought about, well, what can we do to help better tell that particular story? And I'm sure a lot of Berlin residents were wondering, well, I'll be honest, there's not a lot of black people in Berlin. I think we've probably seen less than can fill this room that I've ever seen in one time. So I know a lot of Berlin residents were wondering, well, why does Berlin even have a Juneteenth celebration? Why do we care? Why is this important? So I thought about, we can at least talk about, well, wow, there's these 8 men, and even again, since I haven't even seen this many black people in 2020, in the 2020s, it seems kind of surprising that there would actually be 8 men from this town who would serve in a Civil War regiment whatsoever. As we were doing more research, we learned a little bit more about the 30th and 31st and realized that there were 3 other men. So there was a total of 11 men from the town, and we thought about, well, can we create a documentary to help tell that story? The Wide Awakes come in because, as I was doing research about who they were, I happened to come across a 45-minute documentary on the Curiosity Stream streaming services. I don't know if anybody has heard of that before, but they have a lot of science things, they have a lot of historical documentaries there, but happened to come across this 45-minute documentary about the Wide Awakes. It actually came from the Wide Awake Film Company out of Kansas City, Missouri. I learned a whole lot about it. I shared it with the folks that were in the Avon Historical Society. They were interested in it as well. And since we had basically formed our Berlin Equity Action Team, I thought, well, why not just on a whim, just reach out to them? Same name, they're interested in doing historical documentaries. They've done a number on Gettysburg. They've done a number of other kinds of military history films. I emailed the president of the organization. Took a couple of months, he emailed me back. We had a nice conversation on the phone, and I said, we'd love to be able to do some sort of film. We don't have any money. We're actually asking for grants, but I don't know how much this would cost or whether or not we could afford to do it. Yeah, we could probably do something. We'll pull something together. We actually raised about $10,000 in grant money, and that went towards the formation of this particular film. So you guys are going to see the film. It's a 15-minute film. Again, there are 11 soldiers who served in the 29th, 30th, and 31st Regiment. I did want to tell you about 3 of them, and the 3 of them are kind of important. I brought a few notes to at least talk about that, so I apologize for looking at my laptop for a second. So the first one that I wanted to talk to, and John talked a little bit about the non-commissioned officers, and the 3 folks that I'm going to talk to are non-commissioned officers. But the first one is named Corporal William Sidney. And interestingly, he was born in Onondaga, New York, or the Syracuse area, and he enlisted in February of 1864 in New Haven. And he was a 44-year-old father of 5. He had children anywhere that ranged in age from 16 into 2 months. I'm a little bit older than 44, but I'm a lot closer to 44 than I am to 20 or 21 when you typically might enlist in the Army. He was killed in what was called the Battle of Darbytown Road. And part of our research as well, a common thing that's part of how John and I got connected, was we were starting to research the Connecticut 29th, and we came across the Isaac Hill account as well. But I wanted to read to you a little bit of a passage because it's talked about in the film to some degree, but it's going to help at least set some context as to one of the battles that you're going to see in the film and what that went through. So, from the Isaac Hill account, it said, this talks about the Battle of Darbytown Road. It said the line was drawn up for battle in front of the woods, the white troops on the right and the colored troops on the left. The 8th and the 29th firming the center, the 29th supporting the 8th. They entered the woods and immediately attacked the enemy. At 8 a.m., the battle became general along the whole line, and many a brave soldier fell, killed or wounded. Among them were 13 of the 29th. Corporal William Sidney of Company H was killed instantly charging into the woods. Now, to give you a little bit of a context, I'm reading, I don't have all of this here on my slide, but in researching his particular company, we realized that these men were part of a skirmish group. And a skirmish group was kind of like a scout group that was out trying to figure out where can they soften the enemy up, where there are things that they can then go back and send word back to the rest of the regiment around how to attack or how to specifically win this particular part of the battle. As a corporal, he was in charge of a group of about 10 or 20 men. So he was a leader from that perspective. And this particular group followed the Confederate Army during a torrential rainstorm of 2 days, slogging through the mud in order to chase down Robert E. Lee's forces. And again, think about it this way. These men were chasing those forces, trying to make sure that they weren't being shot at as well. They were sitting through the rain, waiting for the right opportunity to be able to go and attack Robert E. Lee's forces. The rain stopped, the sun came out, 8 a.m. they decided to charge, and that passage that I just read is his last moment as a soldier. Again, he's leading his men to go and try and attack Robert E. Lee's forces. Pretty powerful. I think that was an interesting thing to look at about what his life was. The next soldier I want to talk to you about is Sergeant William Morrison. He's actually a Connecticut native, and he was born in New Milford, Connecticut. He was a waiter in Berlin, and it's interesting, in the film itself, you're going to hear that he was enlisted as a sergeant, meaning that someone decided to give him a non-commission as well. But he fell ill, and some of the things that you'll talk about is there was a lot of disease, unfortunately, for these men. They were walking through lots of wooded areas. They had to drink unsanitary water, and unfortunately, lots of soldiers fell ill with disease. he was in a military hospital for a while. They couldn't really do much with him. He actually went by himself home to New Milford to convalesce with his mama and his father. And after he convalesced, he went back to the line and then fought in the Battle of Kell House and actually was killed in the Battle of Kell House. That tells you how committed he was. He could have just gone home and said, I'm good, Mom, I'm all right, I'm gonna go back. And again, he could have gone and continued to be a waiter or done something else. But this man was so committed to the cause that he came back from Connecticut again in order to fight and died in battle. The last one that I want to talk about was Sergeant James Smith. He also was from the Syracuse area as well originally, and he was wounded in the skirmish line as well. Interestingly, he had a wound to his knee as well and convalesced in the hospital before that as well. We actually do know where his burial site is, and he's buried in Richmond, Virginia, along the battle lines from there. A little bit about me. You're asking who am I, why is this important as well? I am a Connecticut native, although I didn't really grow up in Connecticut. I was born in Hartford, but I left when I was about 10 years old. And I grew up in Mount Vernon, New York, which is just outside of New York City. But interestingly, my family has been here in Connecticut for over 100 years. And my roots come from the state of Georgia, and most of my family, both on my mother's and my father's side, came up in the Great Migration in the early 1900s. One of my relatives actually is already existing part of Connecticut history. So if you guys have ever been to Hartford, you may have come across a street that is named after my ancestor, or my cousin, I should say, and his name is Bose Barlow. And Bose Barlow was Connecticut's first black senator. He was also Connecticut's first black judge, and he did those things in the 1950s and 60s. So again, he's a little bit older than me. He's actually my grandfather's cousin. Had an opportunity to meet him a couple times, but great to see that the Barlow name is part of Connecticut history as well. All right, with that, we can show our film. So we're going to let the credits roll just for a second. All of our soldiers are listed here, what their occupations were. I think it's important. As they're growing, just wanted to share with the audience that we won an award for this film. We're super excited about the fact that we had entered into the Mystic Film Festival in this past October, and we actually won an award for Best Connecticut Film. So we're super excited about that. We are hoping to take it on the road. This is actually one of the first times that we have taken it on the road. And we're entering it in a variety of other film festivals as well, so we're hoping to get confirmation that will be included and hopefully more to come on that. I do have some cards. I didn't bring flyers as much as John did, but we are raising funds as well. One of the things that we're looking to be able to do is the Worthington Ridge Meeting House is Berlin's oldest standing structure. And it actually has fallen into disrepair, and there's a fire, I believe, in the back in the 1970s that kind of gutted the inside. It used to be town hall, and it also used to be a schoolhouse as well as a few other uses as well. The Berlin Historical Society is hoping to be able to move the museum to the Worthington Meeting House at some point in time. It's estimated that it may take up to $2 million to refurbish that particular structure, not asking everyone to contribute $2 million. But what we are trying to do is we are trying to raise money to create an interactive, immersive exhibit in the Worthington Meeting House. And our film would be prominently focused in there, but we all want to tell the story about the Wide Awakes. There was a whole abolitionist movement that Berlin really played a critical role in, especially given our lantern, we want to make sure that we focus that as well. So if anyone is interested in contributing to that, I do have cards available. You can scan our QR code on my card and find out a little bit more about that, and there's a place for you to donate from there as well. So I guess with that, do we want to do questions now, or do you want to wait towards the end of the
Well, to
program?
the end. I just want to let everybody know, if you notice at the beginning of the film, there was a couple of shots where there were soldiers holding what looked like a lantern on a long pole. That's what the Wide Awake lantern that we have looks like. It looks just like that. It's metal. It's about 5 feet tall, and it would be carried. Now, yours was especially made, probably.
It was, yeah. Ours, actually, if anyone wants to come in during the reception, I have pictures of it that I'm happy to share as well for other folks that are interested in it. They just we'll answer questions at the end. So
yeah, because I think John Noone would like to show his parts of his film and explain how his came about, because it has a whole different
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So again, thanks for, we're thrilled to be here and happy to answer questions at the reception.
Yeah.
On to John.
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me? I'm going to put this down. I got a little bout with chicken pox right now, unfortunately. So I'm not COVID, so I'm carrying my mask. I'm trying not to touch anybody. Thank you for inviting me here today with these distinguished folks who made the movies, and John Mills, who gave that presentation, that wonderful presentation earlier. It's my honor to be here today to present something that I made for the Connecticut Army National Guard. I was a member of the Guard for 42 years, from the age of 17 when I joined in New Haven until I retired a few years ago at the age of 60. I was forced out. I wanted to stay, but they just forced me out. But at the end of my career, I had many job titles in the military, in the Connecticut National Guard. I was deployed twice to 2 war zones. And at the end of my career, they made me what's called an equal opportunity advisor for the Guard. Basically, my responsibility was to make sure that people were treated fairly with distinction and dignity throughout the Guard, no matter what their culture or their race was, or their gender. So I did that for a couple of years at the end of my career, and it was one of the most fulfilling jobs that I actually did have in the Guard during my entire 42-year career there. One of my responsibilities was to bring awareness in the several different honoring months of different cultures and different experiences from different ethnic groups that existed within the Guard. So every year we would celebrate Black History Month, and we would put on some sort of presentation to the Guard members so as to make them aware of what it meant to be a different culture of who they might have been. After about 2 years of different presentations, I came across this story about the 29th Infantry Division out of New Haven, and I was intrigued by it because obviously it's a militia story, which is what we were, a militia. It's a Connecticut story, and more so for me, it was a New Haven story because I grew up in the city of New Haven, and I actually played baseball in that Criscola Park where you saw the monument that had been placed. That's where the 29th was mustered, and they departed from New Haven on a steamboat to Maryland and then Beaufort, South Carolina. I played baseball on that field when I was a kid. I went to church about 2 blocks away every Sunday. I never knew that this story existed. Even growing up in the schools of New Haven, they never taught us about this story. This story was a lost story in history. And when I found out about it 40 years later, I was amazed by the story. This is a story of bravery and honor. As John said, these men volunteered for these positions. They were not recruited, they were not forced to be in there. They were not drafted. They volunteered for these positions. They were fighting for a cause. They were discriminated against while they were in the military. They were given supplies that were inferior to the white soldiers. When they left for Maryland, they were one of only 4 regiments in the entire country that maintained their state designation because so many men volunteered. As I said, 1,600 came down to volunteer. Initially 1,200, it swelled to 1,600. They could only take 1,000 for the 1st regiment. So many men volunteered that everybody was basically from Connecticut. So they maintained their state designation throughout the war. Only 4 in the country did that throughout the war. The rest of them were incorporated into the U.S. colored troops. So this is when they went down to Maryland. By the way, they were the quartermaster who was assigning the tents and the places to stay found out that they were a full colored regiment. Thought, oh well, he thought that they were a combination of whites and blacks and everybody, but they found out that they're a full color regiment. They actually put them in the outskirts of the city. to camp in the outskirts of the city. There was no supplies given to them. They were cold and freezing. It was an icy experience for them down in Maryland in the middle of the winter time. I don't even know what their food situation was there, and then they were shipped to South Carolina after that. But they were very discriminated against throughout, but they fought with honor, and that's what I wanted to expose to the people of the Connecticut Army National Guard and the Connecticut Air Guard as well. So together with soldiers from the Connecticut Army Guard and the Air Guard audiovisual department, we created this is really a narration of the book by Alexander Noone, the book Out of the Briars. So we took excerpts from it, we narrated the whole thing with soldiers from the Connecticut Army National Guard and the Air Guard's assistants, and we put it all together. So it's really about an hour and a quarter narration of the entire book, with little explanations prior and at the end. There's songs in there, there's a lot of things in there. I narrowed it down for this event to only a half an hour. So what you're going to get is sort of an explanation of the battles in between, from when they initially got incorporated into the military until Richmond. I left out the ends and I just gave you what's in the middle. So today you're going to get the description of what the battles were like for them and what they had to go through for this service to their country. With that, I'd like to start the film, and I hope you enjoy it.
Well, thank you everybody for coming today. I want to thank John Mills, John Noone, Chris Barlow, and everybody who participated in this. Two quick things. The Connecticut 29th flag, you saw a piece of it in this last film at the beginning. It was like cut in half. That flag has been brought up from the cellar of the Capitol and is now on display in the Capitol building. It's actually in the Legislative Office building, and so it's the hallway that goes between the two, but it's on permanent display. And also, I think I see in the back, is that Dan Hayden? If you don't know, we have a museum to the Civil War here in Connecticut in Vernon, the New England Civil War Museum. Dan, I saw him come in partway through, and he's the executive director for that. You can chat with him afterwards if you want to know more. It's a very good museum, and working on adding the 29th and the 30th into the narrative of the museum, as well as the African American experience that's coming along. So, we could do questions now, or we could go right to the reception and you can chat with the speakers, however anybody would like to do that, but I know you've been sitting for 2 hours. You need to get up and move, I realize that. Bathrooms are back there outside in the door, and we're going to have coffee and refreshments over here, so maybe that's the way to do it. Everybody will hang around, and that'd be great. Thank you so